If I was to ask you the question, what is the most important letter? Remember those things? Those are old-fashioned too. Letters that you get in the mail. Remember those things, everybody? If I was to ask you what is the most important letter that you've ever received or you ever read, I wonder if we passed around the microphone what that would be. I wonder if some would say, well, I read a letter, it was my marriage proposal. How many know that'd be weird, right? My marriage proposal. Remember how we used to do it when we were kids? Will you marry me? Check the box. That's how I did Patty. I still have the letter, everybody, all right? So maybe that was an important letter. Maybe some of you might be old enough to remember draft letters. Let's not go there, though. Maybe you got in the mail a job offer in writing, and that was the most important letter ever. Well, I believe that we're getting ready to dive into perhaps the most important letter that is now a book of the Bible that was ever written in mankind, in the history of mankind. Matter of fact, many theologians consider the book of Romans to be the greatest letter ever written. Matter of fact, they say if we had to discard the rest of the Bible, if it was taken away from us, if we had the book of Romans would explain to us the whole message of salvation. We're lost, we get saved, what we do after that. They say things like this. Theologians say things like this. And even literature critics that are not necessarily believers say that the book of Romans perhaps is the most life-changing work of literature that was ever composed. How many know that's a big statement? And if that's true, how many know we owe it to ourselves to dive into this as followers of Jesus? And again, most theologians will say things like it's the most influential work in Christian history. Matter of fact, here's an interesting point of trivia. Harvard Law, they read through the book of Romans every semester because it's written like an attorney would argue a court case. So if you start reading through the book of Romans, come on, old timers, you can put it up against Perry Mason, all right? Some of you don't know anything about Perry Mason. That was a bad illustration. But it's written like a court case. Paul will try to presuppose, he will answer questions knowing ahead of time that you have a question, and he'll try to answer the question before the question is really asked. And so that's one of the reasons that Harvard Law reads it. Here's what I want you to grab hold of. If we grab a hold of the message in the book of Romans, it will revolutionize our walk with Christ. Some of us have been walking with Jesus for a week. Some of us have been walking with Jesus our whole lives. But I still believe there is room for us to grow and get deeper roots and greater revelation. Come on, you have to agree with that, right? And so if we boil down the book of Romans, if we boiled it all the way down, Romans really is about the gospel message. Now watch this. I want to give some language that some of us are not familiar with. Romans is about the gospel. Now, the whole Bible is not necessarily the gospel message. The New Testament is the gospel message. So, Romans is about the gospel. And the gospel, the definition for the gospel, how many ever heard that term, the gospel? You wave at me, all right? So you heard the term gospel. Well, the gospel, it means good news. So why is the gospel good news? It's because in the New Testament, we are introduced to amazing grace. And we are no longer saved by our works, but we are saved by His amazing grace. And that's the good news of the gospel. Amen, everybody? And so if you boil down the book of Romans, it's really about the gospel of good news, which is the message of grace. Some would even say that the book of Romans is almost like the commentary or the expansion of the book of Galatians. Now, I did the book of Galatians a couple years ago. Matter of fact, if you go to our webpage, the icon looks like that. You can click on that if you want to do them simultaneously. And so some say it's kind of a deeper dive into the subject of grace and being saved by grace of the book of Galatians. Now, here's what's cool. When we get into the book of Revelations, here's some of the things I believe that you're going to learn. Or if you get a revelation of this whole book of Romans, it teaches us things that will get in us. And it has themes that will get in us, things like this. We are more than conquerors. How many wouldn't mind getting that cemented into you every once in a while? Come on, 3 of you. When all hell comes against you, to be reminded, man, if I get a revelation of Romans, then I know, because the Bible has got in me, that no matter what hell comes against me, I'm more than a conqueror. I love that terminology, more than a conqueror. In other words, I'm not just skidding by, but I'm more than victorious. And in other words, I won by a mile. Come on, somebody. I'm more than a conqueror. It will get into us, and it will give us themes like, there is now therefore no condemnation because we are now in Christ Jesus. That's what grace does. Grace gets rid of guilt and shame and condemnation. Romans will get into our heart and tell us that because of Jesus, and when we get with Jesus or give our life to Jesus, we reign. Another way of saying that we're conquerors. It tells us things like that above everything. Nothing will separate us from the love of God. Nothing. Not height, nor depth, nor principalities or powers. Not whoever's in office or not in office. Come on. No matter what pandemic comes or goes, come on. Nothing will separate us from the love of God. And the big theme in Romans is the theme of righteousness. Now, righteousness is a Bible word. It's kind of a churchy word we use a lot in church. But righteousness simply means that we're in right standing with God. How many would like that to be the case in your life, right? I'm in right standing. So when we read over words like righteousness, the Bible's just telling us that we're in right standing with God. The book of Romans uses the word righteousness, depending on the translation, over 60 times in the book of Romans, because Paul wants us to know, because of the message of Romans, because of the message of grace, we are now in right standing with God. And he says it over and over and over and over. Come on, everybody. And in fact, he will reinforce it by saying, it doesn't matter what side of the tracks you come from. It doesn't matter what you've done in the past. When we receive Jesus, we are in right standing with God. Now, I don't know what else to say to make you cheer, but that's good news right there. That's the gospel message. Now, the book of Romans, it's broken down into, again, today's just a light introduction. Get ready for next week. Come with a seatbelt next week, I'm just telling you, all right? But here's the 5 kind of what I call the divisions of Romans. I don't know if that terminology is original with me, the 5 phases of Romans. Here's kind of, if you took the whole 15 chapters and broke them down into subcategories, it kind of looks like this. So the first division is that of sin. And so Romans 1 through Romans 3, those verses particularly, it talks about sin. Now, a lot of people get hung up right here at the end of chapter number 1, and I'll explain why as we get into that. But Paul basically, he starts with, let me tell you some good news and some bad news. How many want to hear the bad news first? Let me see your hands in light. Yeah, I always want to hear the bad news first, right? Because then the good news might be even gooder. How many know what I'm saying, right? Okay, so he starts off with sin. And by the way, that's where we all start off. We all have to recognize that all have sinned and come short of the glory of God. Mm-hmm. And how many know we're all born sinners, so there's not necessarily different levels of sin. Like there isn't worse sinners than others, although maybe sometimes we've done some things that in the natural look worse. We're all sinners and we all walk through the same door of grace. So he starts with sin, and I'm going to explain why he starts there in just a minute. And that's why a lot of people can never get beyond chapters number 1, 2, and 3, because all it talks about is we're all sinners. I mean, that's like a depressing book. How many know what I'm talking about? But how many know every good movie starts with the problem first? Okay, and then he moves into the second phase, which is the phase of salvation. That's the good news. That's Romans chapter 3 through Romans chapter number 5. He's going to say we're all sinners, but God made a plan, and the plan is salvation, and Jesus gives us salvation. Come on, isn't that good? And then he moves into phase number 3, which is sanctification. And this is Romans chapter number 6 and all the way through Romans 8. Now, let me just bring some quick clarity to that. There's a difference between salvation and sanctification. I'm going to simplify it right here. We'll get into it deeper as we go. But salvation, when you get saved, you're no more saved today than you were the day you got saved. There's not levels. There's not seniority of salvation. How many know some Christians need to be reminded that? How many know what I'm saying? Well, I've been saved longer than you've been born. Whoop-de-doo. You know, we're all going, all right? We're all getting on the bus. You know what I'm saying, everybody? And so I'm no more saved today than so I've been serving God. I've been following Jesus for over 50 years now. But I'm no more saved today than the day I gave my life to the Lord. There's not levels, okay? You don't earn, I've been serving God. I got my 10-year card, and now I get to ask for these things. No. But there are levels of sanctification. So when you give your life to the Lord, you're saved. But sanctification is how we start walking it out and looking more like Jesus. Here's a better definition. It's letting go of the past or letting go of the things of the world and grabbing more a hold of the things of God. That's sanctification. How many been serving God long enough that you look back and go, what was I thinking? Right? How many look back on yesterday and say, what was I? No, you don't have to raise your hand on that. Okay, but that's the process of sanctification. And a lot of Christians, they will view salvation as your golden ticket to go to heaven. I got saved. Yeah, but now there's a journey. And Paul reinforces you don't get saved by works, but when we get saved, some works ought to be a byproduct of who we are. I'm glad you said yes. All right. Number 4 is, then we talk about phase 4 is the sovereignty of God. This is Romans 9 through Romans chapter 11. And this really talks about why God saves us and how God's sovereign. And in other words, I'll say it my way, He's large and in charge. And His ways are higher than our ways. And He's sovereign. And He has a plan that makes no sense to us sometimes. Right, everyone? So we're going to talk about the sovereignty of God. And then lastly, we're going to get into the service of God. Romans 12 through chapter 15. And this is the practical part of Romans. This helps us understand, well, we started out as sinners, we got saved, we're on the road to sanctification, God's in charge, but now we got saved through grace, we ought to be doing something about it. Not because we have to, because we want to. In fact, Paul calls it, he says, this is our reasonable service. I mean, how can we be saved by grace and then just sit around and do nothing about it, right, everybody? It changes the whole attitude of why we're serving God. I hope you're here not because you feel like you have to be, but you're here because you want to be. All right, I'll believe that one. That was pretty good. So he reinforces we're not saved by works, but we eventually should want to do something out of our love for what He's done for us. Come on now. I hate doing dishes, but because I love my wife, I roll up my sleeves. Come on now. Look at her amen in me. Woo! Come on, girl, right? See, this deals with our... Now I have to do them. I got witnesses. That was a bad illustration. Our conduct and our character and how we serve God is right here in part number 3. Okay, so what we're going to do today, we're going to dive in. I think we're going to try to do 4 verses. We'll see how far we get. But we're going to kind of skip some of the preliminaries. Again, today's water baptism, and I want to get you to some meat in Romans chapter number 1. Many people that have been in church have heard this verse, and so we're going to dive right in to Romans 1, and we're going to try to do verse 16, 17, 18, and 20. All right? You guys ready? Put on your fast listening, because here we go. Romans 1, here's what it says, verse number 16. Paul's writing, and he says, I like to highlight the words I'm going to spend time on. How many know we're in trouble looking at that, right? So, for I am not ashamed of the gospel, because it is the power of God that brings salvation. A lot has already been said. I'm not ashamed of the gospel. I'm not ashamed of grace, because grace is the power of salvation. Okay. To everyone. To who? To everyone. Who does what? Believes. First to the Jew, then to the Gentile. For in the gospel, the righteousness of God is revealed. In other words, in grace, the righteousness, right standing with God, is revealed. So what he's saying is, grace is revealing how we have right standing with God. Okay? And a righteousness that is by faith. It's not by our works, it's by faith. From first to last, just as it is written, the righteous will live by faith. Okay, so verses number 16 and 17, he's given us an answer to a problem that he hasn't stated yet. Okay, remember, it's written like a courtroom case. So he's saying, ladies and gentlemen of the jury, the answer is 4. Now, the problem is 2 plus 2, okay? So he's given the solution because he's getting ready to unveil the problem. You guys tracking? Okay, and so verse number 16, he says some things that I just want to go back to. Verse number 16, here's what he says. He says, I'm not ashamed. Here's another word. The Greek word means 2 words. Depending on what translation you have, you might see one of these words, but most of our English versions don't give both words. When he says, for I am not ashamed, another word or another meaning is I'm not offended. So it means both. I'm not ashamed of the gospel, or I'm not offended by the gospel. That's what he's saying here. And you say, well, why is that important? Let me back up and say why it's important to understand that Paul is saying, I'm not offended by the gospel. Because many were offended by the gospel at this time. Because they had been working so hard to get their salvation through their works, through their good church attendance and their good morals and their good ethics. And now all of a sudden some people come along and say, yeah, but that's not how you get to heaven. You get to heaven through this free gift called grace. Now all of those churchy people, those suchy-much people, come on, that have been working so hard and they got their Sunday school perfect attendance buttons, they're offended that you're coming along after I've been working so hard and saying it's a free gift. But how many of you are glad that we're living on this side of the free gift? Amen, everybody? Right. And so he's saying, and he's also at the same time, he's saying, and I'm not ashamed of this. Now, Paul had worked harder than anybody. He was the most religious. He had an encounter with God. And he's saying, I'm not offended by this. I'll receive it. He had worked hard, but I'm not offended that I'm saved by grace. Do you know in America more than any other country, we're offended by the gospel because we like to earn things. And we cannot stand that something free is being given to us. And we still are trying to work for this thing. Paul is saying, no, I'm not offended by it. I'll receive it because my righteousness is as filthy rags in the sight of God. If you do everything right, how many know you're still wrong? Because we're sinners. And he says, I'm not ashamed of it. By the way, today, in just a few more minutes, we're going to be doing some water baptism over here. And water baptism is a way of saying, I'm not ashamed of the gospel. I'm not ashamed of my relationship with God. I'm loud and I'm proud. How many know the rest of the world is throwing parades and carnivals and they're loud and proud about what they're into? It's time that the church would stand up and be loud and proud and not ashamed of the gospel. And I love what he says. He says it's the power. Grace is the power that brings salvation with God. And who's it for? Everyone. And he says it's for the Jews first and then the Gentiles. So the gospel is power. For what? For salvation. And you need to understand that he's writing this letter. This is a radical new message. Grace, he's saying, is how we are saved. And who gets saved by this? Everyone who believes. Now let me just take a poll here real quick so we can level the playing field. How many of you have secrets? Let me see your hands. How many of you have skeletons in the closet? Let me see your hand. Come on, keep them up there for just a minute. How many have more than one skeleton in the closet? Some of you better raise your hand or I'm coming after you. I'm coming off this platform because I know, there we go, 2 hands. That's more like it, all right. How many have the closet jam-packed full with skeletons, right? Okay, here's what I'm trying to say. The gospel message is for all of you that have skeletons in the closet. Come on now, it's for you. Now watch this. It's for everyone. Now here's the difference. Everyone who does what believes. Now here's the key. Our language doesn't pick up on these subtleties, but there's a difference. The difference is, do we believe that or do we believe in? That's the difference. There's a lot of people that believe that God is real. That's head knowledge. But there's fewer people that believe in God and the message of the gospel. Let me give it to you this way. I brought this little chair out here today. So I believe, come on, how many of you would raise your hand and agree with me? I believe that is a chair. Okay, how many believe that is something to sit on? Whew. Man, I thought we're going to have to go way back, all right? I believe that is something to sit on. Now, that's head knowledge. That's something to sit on. That is, we're going to call it a chair, okay? That is a chair. But I don't believe in that chair until I place my life in the chair. See, I believe that it is a chair, that it's a chair or a stool, whatever you want to call it. Come on, stick with me, people. But I don't believe in it until I'm willing to put all my being in it, on it, supporting on it. That's the difference right there. See, a lot of people believe that there's a God, but do you believe in God? Come on. That's why John 3:16, the wording in John 3:16 is very particular. It says, "For God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son, and whoever would believe that God is real, whoever would believe in him, whoever would place their life, their faith in him, put their whole being, in him we live, in him we move, in him we have our very being." The gospel message actually is powerful, everybody. This message of grace is powerful. The message of the gospel is so powerful, it will transform your thinking. It will break addictions. It will redeem us. It will adopt us. It will make us children of God. And it's for everyone. Let me hurry up. Verse number 17. Let's check out verse number 17. "For in the gospel, in the good news of grace, in the gospel, the righteousness of God is revealed." The righteousness of God is not revealed in all our works. The righteousness of God is revealed in the gospel, the good news of grace message. That's where it's revealed. And by the way, how do we get it? It's by faith. It's not by earning it. It's by faith. How many know sometimes by faith is harder than earning? Right? Now watch this. A righteousness that comes from faith. Now watch this verse right here. This little saying, righteousness of God is revealed by faith. Please remember that. Take a picture of it if you need to, because this verse is the hinge pin of the whole 15 chapters. Everything he's going to say from here moving forward is hinged upon the very fact that righteousness of God is revealed through faith, the gospel message. Now, people say God's mean. No, the New Testament tells us, the whole Bible does, but this tells us that he's a loving God, that he knew we couldn't get to him, so he came to us because he loved us so much. So we are no longer is it a righteousness by our works. That has to sink into some. It has to sink into the judgmental Christian, because we like to point out people that aren't doing the works we think they ought to be doing and cast them out of the community. And so watch this. This is a huge statement. Here's what Paul is saying. In fact, I'm on it on the screen. Watch this. Now, right standing with God is based on my right believing, not on my right doing. So remember, it's a courtroom, so Paul's given us the antidote. And the antidote is the gospel. It's grace. Salvation from what's coming. He's telling us all about salvation from what's coming. Next week, we're going to dive into what's coming, verses number 18 through 32. And verses number 18 through 32, what Paul has just done, he says, you are saved by faith through grace, and you're saved from, and then he gives this long list. Have you read it? It's a really long list of all the naughties. Many people will use this verse to beat others up and cast them into hell. Because, you know, Christians say hell as a 3-syllable word. How many know what I'm saying, right? And so they use this list. If you do this, you're going to hell. If you do this, you're going to hell. But that is not what this chapter means at all. These are a result of how we will live if we suppress the truth and don't receive his grace. Okay? And so we'll deal with that next week. But if you read that list, verses number 18 through 32, we're going to do it next week, but here's just a little teaser on it. There's some things in that list that we like to pick out and say, oh, they can't go to heaven if they do these things. But it's interesting because we like to pick out the things that we don't do. But if you read the list really close, there's some things in there that everyone in here I know has done probably yesterday. Because he says in that list things like greed. When we suppress the truth, we will live with greed in our lives. I know Christians on their way to heaven that deal with greed. In fact, there's only two reasons that we don't trust God with our finances. Number one reason is fear, and number two is greed. Ooh, sorry. Ooh, ouch. Ooh. Right? In the list, he deals with gossip. Now, we don't know anything about gossip because Christians call gossip prayer. How many know what I'm saying? You know, we need to pray for that girl. Oh, child, I'm telling you now. Woo, right? Don't even act like you don't know what I'm talking about. Okay, I'll give you one of mine. He says, in the list, he talks about being arrogant. I've been arrogant. I've been egotistical. I've been a know-it-all. Yeah, come on, girl, yeah. And some others ought to be saying, me too. Okay, here, this is in the list too. Disobeying their parents. See, what we like to do is cherry pick. We like to go to that section of verse and use some of those things to throw people into an eternity without God because maybe they love God and they're still struggling with something, or they're not as far along on the journey as you are. Come on. And we are never supposed to take the Bible and weaponize the Bible to beat up a group of people that aren't where we're supposed to be. Matter of fact, I gotta close, but watch this. Don't ever use a scripture as a magnifying glass on somebody else, but rather a mirror on yourself. I mean it. I am so tired of people using verse 18 through 32. This is one of the reasons I was unsure of preaching this chapter number 1, because so many people have abused these verses that we're like allergic to it. And we've thrown so many people out of the church because, oh, you do that thing, right? And rather it ought to, by the way, these are all a result when we suppress the truth, when we don't receive the gospel of grace, everybody. Here's the deal. The heart of the problem is that we all have a heart problem. And the cure, come on, everybody, is more grace. I almost said more cowbell, but some of you wouldn't have got that. Romans chapter 1. What did he say, Martha? Okay, Romans chapter number 1, let's skip to verse number 18. Let me see if I can do these two verses. The wrath, wait a minute. We've been talking about God's grace and God's love. This is an abrupt change. Verse 16 and 17, can we camp there? That's about his love and righteousness. Woo! Unicorns and rainbows. This is good stuff. Verses number 16 and 17 will build your church. Verse number 18 will empty your church out. It's such an abrupt change because he starts then. Remember, he's given the answer before the problem. Here comes the problem. The answer is grace. The problem is his wrath. Watch this, watch this. The wrath of God is being revealed from heaven against all the godlessness, then it goes into that list that I just referred to, and wickedness of people who suppress the truth. You shall know the truth, and the truth will set you free. John 1:1, I am the truth, I am the way, right? Jesus is the truth. So watch this. When we suppress the truth, we receive God's judgment. We receive God's wrath. But God's wrath was already put on Jesus, so we can either receive Jesus through grace and faith, and now the wrath that was owed to me is on Jesus, or we can suppress the truth or suppress Jesus and have God's wrath. The choice is ours, right? Listen, Paul he has to introduce the wrath of God. People like to bypass this. Well, his wrath is not really like our wrath. And there's some truth to that. Like our wrath is out of control. Let's run somebody off Highway 5. Let's tell them they're number 1. You know what I'm talking about? We're just rage. That's not God's wrath. But the fact of the matter is God still has wrath. And many of us like to ignore the fact that there's this penalty, there's this judgment for sin. Come on. But Jesus stepped in the place of the judgment if we receive that, or we can suppress that. Are you guys with me on this so far? See, we will never appreciate the good news of the gospel of grace if it's not put against the backdrop of guilt and sinfulness and the wrath of God. We will never appreciate the love and the grace and the forgiveness of God if we don't understand that there's a penalty and there's a judgment and there's the wrath of God. Come on, it's like a jeweler when he tries to sell you diamonds. Anybody ever got engaged? He takes the diamonds out, and what does he do? He takes the diamonds and he puts them on the backdrop of a black cloth. Why? Because of the contrast. The diamond sparkles brighter on the contrast to something that's dark. His grace shines brighter when we recognize we are all sinners that desperately need His grace, everybody. John 8:32 says, then you will know the truth, and the truth is what will set you free. You will know Jesus, and Jesus will set you free. Or you can suppress Jesus, and then you will start living like all these things. And next week we'll talk about what does the wrath of God really look like. Okay, we'll talk about that next week. But some, just to conclude this, some would say, well, how could I ever serve a God that has wrath? Come on, mamas, where are you at in the room? I know some mamas that can love, they're sweet as syrup. But they got some wrath in them. How many know? There's some mama bears. Whoa! How many know? Come on. How many know the rest of this statement? Your mama is the most loving. She feeds you. She tucks you in. And now you're back there playing with all your friends and you're too loud and too noisy and she's trying to get a nap or trying to get rest or whatever she's doing. And she has had it. And the door flings open and you hear, wah, wah, wah. Come on, everybody knows what's going to happen. She says, I've had it with you kids. I have had it up to... Look at everybody in the whole room. See, mama can love you, but mama still has some judgment, some wrath, some anger, some penalty for your stupidity. How many know what I'm saying, right? Okay, all right. If there isn't wrath or punishment for sin, then the need for grace is irrelevant. And the fact that He even gave us grace, the fact that we even have to talk about it is His grace. Okay, now let me hit this one last verse, verse number 20, and this is where we'll pick up next week. For since the creation of the world, God's invisible, because some are arguing, remember, He's a court case. So He's trying to head off the question that's already in your mind. Oh yeah, but what about those that have never heard the gospel? No, those that are in some island and never been to a church service or don't know about God. He deals with that too. Check it out. For since the creation of the world, God's invisible qualities, His eternal power and divine nature have been clearly seen. Come on, everybody. I mean, the moon didn't just all of a sudden one day appear. God stepped on nothing and said, let there be. In other words, if there's a creation, there has to be a creator. Okay, I brought a bottle of water to the platform today, and I know I'm over time, but check this bottle of water out. This is a cool bottle, isn't it? Thank you, Matt, for this water. Blue cap, isn't that nice? Woo, blue cap. Love the little design on there. The bottle kind of goes in the middle. And wouldn't it be silly to just say, well, that water in that bottle just evolved one day? If there is a creation, somebody had to create. Come on, how ludicrous for us to think, well, you know, one day the water was flowing down the stream. By the way, who invented the water in the stream? But that's another day. And it was just flowing down the stream, and all of a sudden, that one piece of water hit this leaf, who created the leaf, and it hit a rock, and it reflected off the sun, and all of a sudden, it started making this hard, clear plastic stuff, and it formed this thing called a bottle. And then some other water kept on rolling down there, and it created this cool little logo that says core, and hydration, and pH, and all this, and then all of a sudden, like another 1,000 years later, and some things floated down, and it made some blue plastic, and then all of a sudden, it just kind of screwed itself on it, and it did it 1 billion times over. If there's a creation, there's something inside of us that says there has to be a creator. That's what Paul is saying right here, everybody. He's saying no one has an excuse. That everyone somehow inside of them have been clearly seen, being understood from what has been made, so that people, watch what Paul says, are without excuse. Now, you might not come to church and say the sinner's prayer, but there's something in us that wants to look to heaven and call out to heaven. All right, everybody? One last thing is that we know there's a lawmaker, because even if we don't believe in God, we all steal from God. Because if somebody in your family got murdered, excuse the horrible illustration, murdered or raped, come on, you would demand that there would be justice. Now you want wrath and you want judgment. Come on, everybody. But even those that say they don't believe in God have to steal that from a moral lawgiver. And his name is God. Amen, everyone? All right, I got to end right there for today. Will you receive our introduction to the introduction?